Program now, though, let's go straight to our panel of politicians. Joining me here in Canberra, the Veterans Affairs Minister, Alan Griffin. Good morning.
Good morning, Ashley.
And from Melbourne this morning, the Shadow Environment Minister, Greg Hunt. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Ashley.
Alan Griffin, let's start with you. Does the Stern Hu case show just how little influence Kevin Rudd and the government have in China?
I think what it shows is how complex these issues can be when you're dealing with foreign governments and activities such as what's been going on with China with respect to this matter. It's got to be dealt with very sensibly, and it's going to take some time to work it through.
The Prime Minister hasn't spoken with his counterpart on this matter. Even the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, hasn't spoken to his counterpart. Is the fear that if they do call, no one will answer, that they'll be shunned by the Chinese government, which of course would be pretty embarrassing?
Well, I think what we've got to do is take this step by step. There's been numerous contacts made at various levels, and they're working through those levels in a sensible manner, and that's what we've really got to do in this situation.
What's the harm, though, for the Prime Minister to pick up the phone?
Well, I'm not an expert in international affairs or diplomatic matters, and I'm not an expert in the detail of what's occurred in this occasion. I'm confident that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister know what they're doing and are working through those issues.
Greg Hunt, what's the case for the Prime Minister to actually pick up the phone and speak with his Chinese counterpart? That's something the opposition has been pushing for a number of days, but the Foreign Minister seems to think that would be a pretty irresponsible course of action.
Well, the Foreign Minister is wrong, and I say that as somebody who, in the previous government, in the last year, had responsibility for consular matters. I dealt with the case of an Australian businessman in China who was detained on a commercial matter. It was a civil, not a criminal charge, but he was detained. We made sure that there was conversation not just between myself and Chinese officials, but the Australian ambassador, and then we brought the Foreign Minister in early, fast, hard and strong. What we're seeing here is that the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister are paralysed. They are worried about the relationship. They are not worried about the Australian citizen. And that is what Australian governments must do. They are elected to take care and responsibility for Australian citizens at home and abroad.
But Greg Hunt, has the coalition been jumping the gun over this whole matter? Early last week we saw some of your coalition colleagues speculating on why Mr Hu may have been detained. The Foreign Minister says that Mr Turnbull didn't even pick up the phone to get a briefing from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade before the Deputy Leader, Julie Bishop, made representations to the Chinese MC here in Canberra.
Well, let me be absolutely clear. There are two elements here. There's the procedural fairness, the procedural justice, and then there's the substantive case. The substantive case, I'm not in a position to make a judgment on. The procedural case, we are absolutely in a position to make a judgment on, and it is quite clear that there are serious procedural irregularities, that an Australian is being held incommunicado effectively, that the Australian government has not been in contact in any meaningful, serious way with the Chinese government, that the Australian government has not had legitimate, real access to Mr Hu. So those things are very clear. So the answer is simple. Pick up the phone, Mr Rudd, pick up the phone, Mr Smith, speak to your Chinese counterparts and make it absolutely clear there must be procedural justice immediately. And I say that as somebody who did that personally in the previous government and dealt with and was successful in ensuring that an Australian business person did receive procedural fairness.
Alan Griffin, the Prime Minister arrived home today, so we can expect that he will be stepping up his involvement in the handling of this case. But the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, is heading off to Europe with the Hu matter. There's been a death of an Australian in Papua New Guinea. Is this really the time for Mr Smith to be jetting off to Egypt to try to win UN Security Council votes for Australia?
Stephen's a very good Foreign Minister, and the capacity to be able to handle these issues and others is well within his purview. I think the interesting point here, though, is what Greg is saying, which is that this is all being handled according to the way it should be done from my point of view, but not from his point of view, when the real question here is you had Barnaby Joyce shooting his mouth off early, you had Malcolm Turnbull making comments prior to seeking any briefing from government about what actually had occurred. We're getting politics from the coalition grandstanding. We're not getting a proper approach to dealing with the interests of this particular Australian citizen.
There are a couple of new angles to this story this morning. Firstly, there's a report in Fairfax Papers that suggests that the Chinese president actually signed off on the investigation into Rio. Also today, there's another report that Rio Tinto was seeking up to $9 billion in compensation from Chinese steel mills before Mr Hu's arrest. Greg Hunt, what do you make of those reports and the links between Rio's claims for compensation and the link with this arrest?
Well, the reports need to be investigated and confirmed. They are reports at this stage, so I will be cautious. But what is absolutely clear is twofold. Firstly, that there is a mix of politics, economics and law in China. It is not a democracy like Australia. I dealt with this in my previous role. I saw the way in which, and this is the second point, the Australian government can have a critical role in ensuring procedural fairness for Australians in China. And that's why it is so important that as Mr Smith jets off to seek UN votes, he keeps his mind on the care, concern, treatment and fairness of an Australian citizen in China who is clearly not receiving a fair go and procedural justice.
Greg Hunt, as you allude to the previous case that you were involved in, are you suggesting that relations between Canberra and Beijing have actually gone backwards under Kevin Rudd?
I think that the confidence in dealing with the relationship is weaker. And the reason is twofold. Firstly, there is a bifurcated mind within the government towards China. On the one hand, they say, look, the Prime Minister speaks Mandarin, which is good. It's an asset. That's a plus. On the other hand, we have a white paper which declares China as a hostile defensive threat, an extraordinary piece of policy analysis which doesn't fit with the historical patterns. And so there's a lack of confidence in dealing with China. And secondly, the entire foreign policy is skewed by this concern about the UN Security Council. Do we upset China because that will impact on Africa? China now has a huge role and influence over African nations. If we go badly with China, we go badly in Africa, and our Security Council vote will be affected. Keep the focus on Australia's core strategic priorities, the defence of Australian nationals, the defence of Australian economic interests, and the pursuit of enlightened realism as a way of seeking a better, brighter global outcome. But what we're seeing here is a distortion of Australian foreign policy and a lack of confidence in dealing directly with a major power.
I do just want to cover off one other issue with you both very quickly. Over the weekend, Kevin Rudd was overheard doubting the chances of a successful climate change deal at Copenhagen, the big UN conference that will be happening in December of this year. Why is it, Alan Griffin, that Mr Rudd's sounding so optimistic and confident in public, yet in private expressing these serious doubts?
Well, he's made those comments publicly also, that this is going to be a difficult road to hoe, but it's an incredibly important one. We have to get behind reaching an agreement at Copenhagen, but we have to realise it's going to be difficult. And what we need is a situation where we can go forward with certainty about what Australia's position is.
Greg Hunt, Al Gore is in Australia this week. He wants Kevin Rudd's ETS legislation to go through the Senate before the Copenhagen talks. I guess that's not a surprising position, but is he right to suggest that Australia will be in a much better position to take a leadership role at that Copenhagen meeting if that ETS legislation has gone through here?
Well, the single biggest thing we could do in the next month, in the next week, is to agree between the government and the opposition that we want renewable energy legislation to go through as soon as Parliament comes back. I'm willing to sit down today, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, with the government to talk through the renewable energy legislation. Let's get solar, geothermal, tidal, all of the different forms of powerful new renewable energy with the majestic vision of a clean energy economy through the Parliament. That's what we're willing to do. That's an offer that I'm willing to make today, to sit down, to work through the renewable energy legislation. Let's get that through, and then we can have real action immediately, and we can deal with the emissions trading scheme in time so as we're on a level playing field with the rest of the world.
Gentlemen, unfortunately we have run out of time for this morning's panel. Greg Hunt, Alan Griffin, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, we will go to Sky's exclusive interview with President Obama.